Great. Let us move on to the policies. You would think that we're almost done, right? Policies, authentication, API risk, and data types. Unfortunately, this is a very busy set of pages. And I'm saying set of pages because we have the findings, the incidents, custom data policies, allow list, and workflows. In this specific recording, we're going to work with findings and incidents. Okay. And I want you to pay attention to the row count at the very bottom, 195 and 26. These are the out-of-the-box policies that the domain platform is able to detect. Okay? And what you're presented in these tables is their default configurations. The default configuration as is defined by the domain platform when you first install the platform. Okay? That's why you see is default. You're always going to see a value of true. Their name is identifiable in the second column. Their classification or category, also known as module, is identified immediately to the left. Okay. Now, there's an extra column. If I go to the watermark button, I select columns, there's an extra column called type, which is hidden by default, that pretty much gives you the actual type of the finding. Okay. So, which happens to be the same exact thing as the name without that hyphen default. Okay, that's what it means. All right. Okay. Um, so this is number one, right? This is our default configurations for all findings. The different categories of findings is pretty much four in total. I already talked about three. There is a fourth one. But the only ones you're going to find in this page is posture and recon. Okay, why? Because these are the only two modules that have out of the box security vulnerabilities. These are the only two. That's why you see them right here. There's two more, right? Data that I talked about, data policies, which are user defined, hence why you don't see them in here. And then you have custom policies, which are also listed under the findings page, which is also not listed in here because they're user defined. Okay. The main attributes, apart from what we already have talked about, is the severity. They're all set to auto by default. They're all set to auto by default. There's a sensitivity. We're going to discuss sensitivity as soon as we go under incident policies because that's the only one that contains sensitivity values. Everything else, all findings, they don't have any sensitivity. Then we have the user who created a corresponding the corresponding finding, the date it was created, when it was modified. Group, one more time, we see group as being important to the way we configure the no-name platform. In this particular case, how we can configure findings and incidents. And in fact, all of these, with the exception of allow list, have a grouping attribute, and we're going to explain its significance. And then you have something called a policy type, which is a bit of a misnomer in my humble opinion, because this indicates the value that you see right underneath indicates whether the no-name platform is able to detect or is allowed, will be a more appropriate choice of words, is allowed to detect the vulnerability or not. If you see detect issue, that means the no-name platform is configured to detect this vulnerability. If you see mute detection, it's not. Okay. The next thing you will see is the OWASP categories that associate with a corresponding finding or incident. And if you select that +2 or +4, then you will see the list of um, OWASP top 10 API security vulnerabilities that this particular finding is associated with, or this specific incident is associated with. Okay, and it may be more than one, right? It may be more than one. In this case, we have two such uh, API top 10 security vulnerabilities associated with this finding, and so on. Okay. So there is also a pencil button that indicates that we can edit this configuration. For this, I would like to track down one very specific finding type. I'm going to call it unauthenticated modifications. And I want to use something that is easier for all of us to understand, right? So that's why I'm selecting these unauthenticated modifications. And I'm going to go all the way to the right, and I'm going to use this pencil button. Now, unauthenticated modifications is the finding that reports a misconfiguration whereby you have APIs that perform modifications to your data that without any authentication, right? Hence, unauthenticated modification, right? Those findings could use a method post, patch, put, and so on. That's the method that is in play in this type of findings. The name, it's the default, it is the default configuration after all, is not editable. The group, because it is also the default configuration, is not editable. So this default configuration applies to the world, okay? All your APIs. That's what I mean by world. Now you have two values under policy type. Remember, detect issue. The no-name platform is allowed to detect vulnerabilities of this type or findings of this type. New detection is turned off, okay? Then you see the default severity. That severity medium that you see right here is the default severity, even though the severity is set to auto. In fact, all the severities are set to auto. Severity requires a little bit of an explanation, right? And if you expand that, you will see here's the different severities. Info, low, medium, high, and critical with the usual meaning, right? And then you have something called auto, and you may be scratching your head and wonder what the heck is auto, okay? Auto is the severity whereby you allow the no-name platform to find the severity based upon an inspection of the context of a specific incident, of a specific finding, right? Why was this finding triggered? Why was this incident triggered? What are the types of data that are being communicated? How are the information being communicated? This is the type of context I'm referring to, okay? So in this particular case, the default severity is medium because that's what we see right here, right? So every single incident, every single finding has a default severity. So that's our base. So in this particular case, it was set to medium, so the default severity is medium. The next thing the no-name platform is going to do, if you allow it to find the severity by inspecting the context, is going to inspect, all right, what is the data communicated to the internet, or is it internal, intranet, in other words. If it's communicated to the internet, then chances are the severity is going to be bumped up to high. In addition to that, if the data in the request, and I'm saying request for the specific finding and authenticated modifications, because it's the request that has been communicated when you would, it contains the data, the important data when you would like to make updates, right? Put, post, patch, and so on, this type of methods. Is the request contain sensitive data such as social security numbers, emails, this type of information, credit cards, right? If it is, then bump the severity up by one yet again, and this whole thing is going to reach critical, right? Other aspects that we may be considering whether we bump the severity, by we I mean the no-name platform, right? These internal algorithms that inspect the context, is authentication, right? Are we using authentication? Of course, in this case, it's a moot point because we're saying unauthenticated modification, right? So we know we don't use authentication, right? So these are other aspects that we check, right? Okay. That's for auto, right? That's for auto. Okay. Now, if you choose to come in here and modify this, right? Modify this. Let's set it to high, right? Let's set it to high. If we modify this specification and we click save, then we're telling the no-name platform, hey, listen, no-name platform, I do not want you to inspect those internal algorithms. I do not care about them. Instead, every time you see an unauthenticated modification, irrespective of what The context is I want you to set the severity to high. It's exactly what you're saying. Okay? And if we go ahead and we click save, right? Now you're going to see the unauthenticated modification, right? Here it is. It has the severity set to high, and here's who modified it, admin@acme.com. Okay? Now, these type of blanket changes like I just performed right here, I will highly recommend against them, right? Highly recommend against them. The main reason why I do not want to do any of these blanket changes is because they're blanket, right? They're too general, too global to do them. Instead, the best way to perform those changes is do it more surgically, and we're going to see all that now that we're going to go back to incidents. Okay, so your takeaway from this findings is this is the default configuration. That's your takeaway. This is the default configuration, right, for all the out of the box vulnerabilities. What you can change is the severity. If you do not want to have the no name platform identify the severity based upon the context. Okay, and what you can modify is whether it's turned on or off and what the severity is. That's it. Well, let's go to the incidents. Identical pretty much as the findings. The difference is the category, the module, the classification of these incidents. There's only a single classification called runtime. That's the only one you're dealing with. You have 26 in total, and they also have sensitivity, right? Severity applies to most of these, with the exception of the top two, and so on. Which of course we have a mute detection. That means they're no longer identifiable. Okay, keep that in mind. All right, so I'm interested in looking at one very specific one. This API access using a parameter outside the maximal expected range. Okay, and what I would like to do, of course, this is a default configuration, and we can turn on the column that identifies the type as well. There we go. Same thing like before. And I would like to scroll all the way to the right. I believe it was the third. Yes, I'm sure. I'm going to edit. API access using a parameter outside the maximal expected range. Now remember, all the incidents make use of machine learning, those data science model that we learned. We capture what constitutes normal behavior, like I mentioned earlier on. Okay, so this specific incident is there to identify whether there is a value in one of our fields that is out of bounds with respect to what we have learned. What do I mean by out of bounds? It's exponentially larger than what we've seen when we were learning the API behavior. Okay, so for example, we may have a price, right, of an item, of a flight ticket, since we're dealing with a flight domain, right, with an airline domain. If when we were learning the behavior of these API, right, and remember, we need days, we need hundreds, if not thousands of individual users, so we're dealing with thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of different requests, right, when we're learning and capture normal behavior. So as soon as we capture that normal behavior, and now we're seeing all of a sudden, we're seeing a value that is exponentially larger, right? Guess what? We're going to trigger one such incident. Okay, we're going to tag the user as an attacker, and we're going to tag that request as an incident. That's what we're going to do. Okay, like before, name and group read only. Okay. Now I did mention I only gave you one example, right? The price. It could be on the string size, it could be on the array size, and so on. These are the different ways we can capture. You can see these value being triggered. Okay. Severity, same thing like before. It's auto by default. Low is the default severity for this specific incident. And of course, based upon the context, we're going to set the severity. So don't be alarmed if you see the same exact issue as being the same exact incident type for the same API, right? For the same API, same incident type, one being on low severity, the other one being on medium, yet another on high, and yet another on critical. Don't be alarmed. It all depends on the context. And of course, you need to go to the evidence, and I'll show you the evidence in due course in order to identify the context. Okay. Now let's touch base a little bit on sensitivity, and I'll be quick. Right. Sensitivity of 1 indicates that we are triggering less incidents. Sensitivity of 5 indicates that we're triggering more incidents. Now, the difference between 1 and 5 is minuscule. It's a fraction of a fraction. So in all honesty, it makes little difference whether you select 1 or whether you select 5. Okay? My initial interpretation of this slider was it helps me manage false positives, but that's not the case. Okay? That's not the case. And again, my initial definition of this slider, 1 less incidents, 5 more incidents. Okay? I didn't even mention false positives. I'm just giving you my initial interpretation of this slider. My advice to you, never touch the severity, never touch the sensitivity unless you really know what you're doing. And how would you know what you're doing? By gaining more experience, by communicating with us, your technical account managers, your customer deployment engineers, and so on. Otherwise, don't touch this slider, don't touch the severity. Let it be. Okay, let it be. And you may be wondering now why we have spent the past like 10, 20 minutes talking about this if we are supposed to let it be. Because there is a very specific use case that you can use and take advantage of these type of configurations. And remember what I told you earlier on about findings, right? I told you that it's best to do the configuration changes surgically, right? So for example, I have the ability to create a new incident policy, and you have the same ability with findings, create a new finding policy. But we're going to do it for incidents. Smaller, a little more manageable. And let's consider that all the MuleSoft APIs, they do not care about this API access using a parameter outside the maximal expected range. Right? We don't care about this. Or we're getting a lot of these that are false positives, and I don't want to see them anymore. And they're benign for whatever reason, right? So I would like to turn off this specific type of incident type or finding type for a set or a subset of my APIs. How can I do that? Well, we create a group. We add in the group all the APIs I'm interested in turning off a specific incident or finding type because I would like not to be bothered by them. So first step, create a group. We already have a group. Second step, go under settings, policies, locate the incidents or findings, select create new incident policy, identify the type. In our case, the type is API access using a parameter outside the maximal expected range. Give it a name, and I'm going to type mute for MuleSoft because that's exactly what I want to do. I don't care. The root is no longer clickable, selectable, right? Because we already have a configuration that applies to it. And then scroll all the way to the bottom or search and select MuleSoft. Finally, mute the detection and click Save. I'm going to sort this list on type, and I want you to see the two API access using a parameter outside the maximal expected range. The first one is the default that applies to all groups. All groups. That's why you see the hyphen. And then you see the mute for MuleSoft that only applies to MuleSoft. So all MuleSoft APIs, they will never trigger this API access using a parameter outside the maximal expected range. Everybody else still has the ability to do it. And by doing this surgically, you're able to configure the policies or these policies so that they best fit your ecosystem, your APIs. And again, these are ways you as a security professional, as an operator of the no-name platform, you can manage your work. Okay? So that's the main purpose for these policies. Keep the default, surgically create something and modify that for a subset of your APIs, not everything. And with this, my good people, we have concluded this pretty lengthy section of our exercise, of our walkthrough.